Ladies and gentlemen, today we gather to reflect upon a statement that has stirred both controversy and curiosity across the global stage. The words of Professor Jeffrey Sachs, one of the most respected voices in economics and international affairs, have sparked a sharp debate. Navarro is the worst student from Harvard's Aide, an astonishing remark directed at Peter Navarro, a top aide to former U.S. President Donald Trump. Jeffrey Sachs' criticism of Peter Navarro, calling him the worst student from Harvard, is not merely a casual insult or an offhanded remark. It is a statement that carries weight because it comes from one of the world's most respected economists and public intellectuals. Sachs is not known for unnecessary personal attacks. Instead, his reputation has been built on serious scholarship, nuanced understanding of global economics, and a commitment to reasoned debate. When someone like Sachs singles out Navarro in such a sharp and cutting way, it speaks volumes about the depth of frustration that many academics and policymakers feel toward the ideas and rhetoric Navarro has brought into global politics. Peter Navarro, as a senior advisor to former U.S. President Donald Trump, played a significant role in shaping trade and economic policies that had consequences far beyond America's borders. His confrontational style, particularly toward China and later toward other global partners, including India, was always controversial. He often framed global economic competition as a zero-sum battle where cooperation was weakness and conflict was inevitable. This worldview, according to Sachs, reflects not only poor judgment, but also a lack of intellectual rigor that one would expect from someone who was trained at one of the world's top institutions. By calling him the worst student, Sachs was pointing out a deeper issue that Navarro's education had failed to instill in him the analytical discipline, balance, and respect for facts that should guide someone in such a position of power. Navarro's rhetoric around India and the framing of Modi's war is a perfect example of why Sachs' criticism resonates. The idea of reducing India's actions to a war is simplistic and misleading. India, under Prime Minister Modi, has sought to navigate a very complex and shifting international order. It has pursued independent policies that protect its national interests while balancing relations with the United States, Russia, and China. To dismiss these carefully calibrated moves as an act of aggression is to not only misunderstand India's strategy, but also to irresponsibly fan the flames of conflict. Sachs' attack on Navarro, therefore, is not just personal, it reflects his concern for the quality of policymaking that influences billions of lives. Sachs' remark highlights the danger of academic credentials being used as a shield for reckless policymaking. Navarro often presented himself as a Harvard-trained economist, implying that his ideas carried the weight of scholarly credibility. Yet, as Sachs makes clear, education is not simply about acquiring degrees, it is about applying critical thinking, evidence-based reasoning, and intellectual humility. To be a student of Harvard or any prestigious institution carries with it a responsibility to uphold certain standards of truth and rationality. Sachs' dismissal of Navarro as the worst student is essentially a way of stripping away the illusion of authority that Navarro cloaked himself in, exposing the emptiness behind the aggressive slogans. The criticism also reflects a broader frustration with the kind of politics Navarro represents, a politics where complex global realities are reduced to black and white narratives, where diplomacy is substituted with provocation, and where the long-term interests of nations are jeopardized by short-term theatrics. Sachs, by contrast, has always emphasized cooperation, sustainable development, and the pursuit of policies that bring nations together rather than drive them apart. His attack on Navarro is, therefore, also a defense of a more rational, cooperative approach to global governance. In the end, Sachs' words resonate because they capture a truth that many have observed, but few have expressed so bluntly. Navarro's policies and rhetoric have often been criticized for lacking depth, nuance, and respect for the complexities of international relations. By calling him the worst student, Sachs distilled that critique into a single unforgettable line. It is not just about Navarro as a person, it is about the danger of allowing shallow, confrontational thinking to guide the policies of a superpower. It is a warning that words and ideas matter, that education must lead to wisdom, and that those who fail to learn from history and scholarship can do lasting damage when entrusted with power. The danger of reckless rhetoric in politics and international relations is something that history has repeatedly shown us, yet it continues to be a recurring problem when leaders or their advisors choose words designed to provoke rather than to resolve. When Peter Navarro framed India's stance as Modi's war, he was not just making a casual remark, he was engaging in rhetoric that distorts reality, escalates tensions, and misleads both domestic and international audiences. Reckless rhetoric is never harmless. It creates narratives that spread quickly, shape public opinion, and often leave lasting scars on diplomatic relationships. Words, when spoken by people in positions of power, carry weight far beyond the immediate moment. They can ignite anger, deepen mistrust, and in some cases lay the groundwork for real conflict. The problem with such rhetoric is that it oversimplifies complex issues. International relations are never black and white. They are layered with history, culture, economic interests, and strategic considerations. By labeling India's actions as a war, Navarro not only stripped away this complexity, but also placed India in an aggressive light it did not deserve. This kind of language frames the global stage as a battlefield rather than a forum for cooperation. Once such language enters the public discourse, it becomes much harder for leaders to pull back, to negotiate, or to compromise because they are pressured by the very narratives that reckless rhetoric creates. Another danger lies in how rhetoric fuels nationalism and polarization. When a senior advisor to a U.S. president speaks in aggressive terms, the statement is amplified across media outlets, interpreted as official policy, and consumed by millions. This can encourage hardline positions within both the United States and India. For Americans, it may reinforce the idea that India is taking an antagonistic stance, while for Indians it may appear that Washington is as unfairly targeting New Delhi. Instead of fostering mutual understanding, rhetoric of this nature builds walls of suspicion and resentment. Diplomatic bridges that take decades to build can be damaged within minutes of reckless speech. Furthermore, such rhetoric undermines diplomacy by tying the hands of negotiators. Diplomacy thrives on subtlety, flexibility, and room for maneuver. Negotiators must be able to explore compromises without being accused of weakness or betrayal. But when a public figure frames an issue as a war, it locks the discussion into a combative framework. Every concession then looks like a defeat, and every step toward cooperation looks like surrender. Reckless words create psychological barriers that make genuine dialogue almost impossible. The impact of reckless rhetoric is not confined to governments. It also affects ordinary people. Citizens who hear their leaders or their leaders' advisors use the language of war and conflict are left anxious about the future. Businesses reconsider investments, markets react nervously, and communities begin to absorb the hostility implied in such rhetoric. A simple phrase, irresponsibly spoken, can ripple outward to affect economies, societies, and even the safety of people far removed from the original political dispute. Reckless rhetoric also damages the credibility of the one who speaks it. When leaders or advisors resort to inflammatory language rather than thoughtful analysis, they reveal not strength but weakness. They show a lack of patience, a lack of vision, and a lack of understanding of the complexities at hand. In the long run, such behavior erodes trust in leadership. Allies become cautious, adversaries become emboldened, and the speaker's reputation is diminished. For someone in Navarro's position, this kind of language was not just careless, it was irresponsible at the highest level. The danger of reckless rhetoric is that it substitutes noise for substance. It generates headlines but not solutions. It provokes reactions but not progress. It may score political points in the short term, but it leaves behind a trail of damaged relationships and missed opportunities. Leaders and their advisors are entrusted with immense power, and with that power comes the duty to use words with care, wisdom, and foresight. Reckless rhetoric fails that duty, and the world pays the price. The impact of rhetoric such as Peter Navarro's Modi's War statement on U.S.-India relations cannot be underestimated because words spoken by senior officials shape not only immediate perceptions but also the long-term trust between nations. The relationship between the United States and India has been one of careful cultivation, built over decades through trade agreements, strategic partnerships, educational exchange, and defense cooperation. Both countries, as large democracies with global influence, have often found themselves aligned on common goals, from fighting terrorism to maintaining a balance of power in Asia. Yet this delicate relationship is highly sensitive to mischaracterizations, and reckless remarks have the power to undo years of progress by injecting suspicion and hostility into bilateral ties. India has always been deeply conscious of how it is portrayed by global powers, particularly by Washington. Its history of colonial subjugation and its long struggle for independence have instilled in its leadership and people a strong sense of sovereignty and pride. To have an influential U.S. official publicly frame India's actions as a war is perceived not just as an analytical mistake but as a deliberate insult. It portrays India as an aggressor when, in reality, India's policies are often designed to balance competing global pressures while maintaining its independence in decision-making. Such a narrative undermines India's dignity on the international stage and creates friction at a time when cooperation is more important than confrontation. For the United States, missteps like this damage credibility. America has long positioned itself as a strategic partner for India, particularly in countering China's rise and ensuring stability in the Indo-Pacific region. However, if senior U.S. advisors openly use hostile rhetoric toward India, it signals unreliability. Indian policymakers begin to question whether the U.S. sees India as an equal partner or merely as a pawn in its broader strategic battles. This doubt can push India closer toward alternative partnerships, including with Russia or even China, weakening Washington's efforts to cultivate strong, democratic alliances in Asia. The economic relationship between the two countries also suffers under the shadow of such rhetoric. India and the U.S. share a significant trade partnership, with technology, pharmaceuticals, defense, and services being central areas of exchange. However, framing India as engaged in some kind of war with the United States distorts the reality of this interdependence. Businesses and investors pay close attention to political discourse, and inflammatory language can create hesitation in trade negotiations, reduce investor confidence, and lead to unnecessary protectionist measures. Instead of nurturing a win-win relationship, the perception of hostility can result in missed economic opportunities. Public opinion is another dimension where the impact becomes evident. In democracies, leaders must always pay attention to how foreign nations are perceived by their citizens. When rhetoric from U.S. officials paints India negatively, it risks hardening attitudes among Indian citizens toward America. In a country where nationalism is strong, such remarks can be seen as disrespectful, fueling anti-American sentiment and making it politically difficult for Indian leaders to be seen as too close to Washington. The same is true in the United States, where careless language about India can reduce public support for deeper cooperation with New Delhi. Once public opinion shifts, repairing it is a long and arduous process. Perhaps the most damaging impact is on trust, which is the foundation of any partnership. U.S.-India relations have thrived because both countries have gradually built confidence in each other's intentions. Reckless rhetoric erodes that trust. India begins to doubt the sincerity of America's partnership, while the United States risks misinterpreting India's cautious moves as hostility. Miscommunication grows, and opportunities for cooperation in critical areas like climate change, counterterrorism, and defense are jeopardized. In the end, the impact of such statements is not confined to the short-term outrage they provoke. They alter the tone of the relationship, plant seeds of doubt, and create ripple effects across diplomacy, economics, and public perception. U.S.-India relations are too important to be reduced to slogans or confrontational sound bites. They require patience, respect, and nuanced understanding. When advisors like Navarro frame the relationship recklessly, they do not just insult India, they weaken America's own strategic interests and undermine the global stability both nations are striving to protect. India's independent diplomacy has long been one of its defining characteristics on the global stage, and under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, this tradition has been further strengthened. Unlike many nations that align themselves firmly with one bloc or another, India has consistently pursued a foreign policy rooted in strategic autonomy. This independence is not about isolation, but about ensuring that India's choices serve its national interests above external pressures. When voices such as Peter Navarro's describe India's approach as a form of war, they fundamentally misunderstand the logic and philosophy guiding New Delhi's diplomacy. India does not act out of aggression, it acts out of a deep-seated commitment to sovereignty, balance, and pragmatism. The roots of India's independent diplomacy can be traced back to its post-independence years when leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru established the non-aligned movement. At the height of the Cold War, India resisted the temptation to fall completely under the influence of either the United States or the Soviet Union. Instead, it forged its own path, engaging with both sides when beneficial, but refusing to become a subordinate ally. That tradition has evolved with time, and while the Cold War divisions have shifted, India's instinct for autonomy has remained constant. Under Modi, this has been reflected in India's willingness to engage with Washington, Moscow, and Beijing simultaneously, while never compromising on its own strategic interests. One clear example of this independence has been India's handling of defense and energy ties with Russia. Despite growing cooperation with the United States in defense technology and counterterrorism, India has continued to purchase arms and energy resources from Russia. This decision has often been criticized in Western circles, especially during periods of heightened tension between Moscow and Washington. Yet for India, such choices are not about taking sides, but about ensuring a reliable and diversified security architecture. India cannot afford to depend on a single supplier for its defense needs, nor can it ignore long-standing relationships that have served its interests for decades. At the same time, India has deepened its partnership with the United States, participating in joint military exercises, cooperating on space exploration, and strengthening trade ties. The Quad Alliance, which brings together India, the US, Japan, and Australia, reflects New Delhi's recognition of shared concerns in the Indo-Pacific, particularly regarding China's assertiveness. Yet even here, India's approach has been carefully measured. It participates fully in cooperative frameworks, but avoids being dragged into direct confrontations that do not align with its national priorities. Unlike smaller nations that may be pressured into following Washington's lead, India makes it clear that its participation is voluntary and conditional on its own assessments. India's diplomacy also extends to its economic choices. It has maintained strong ties with the Gulf states for energy security while simultaneously cultivating trade relations with Western powers and expanding its presence in Africa. It has been cautious about trade agreements that could harm its domestic industries, even when pressured by powerful economies. This balancing act demonstrates not indecision, but a clear-eyed pursuit of national interests. In a globalized world, India's decisions reflect both pragmatism and foresight, ensuring that its economy remains resilient and self-sustaining. Another defining feature of India's independent diplomacy is its cultural confidence. India does not rely solely on military or economic strength. It also projects soft power through its culture, democracy, and global diaspora. Modi's government has emphasized India's role as a civilizational state, reminding the world that India's diplomacy is shaped not only by strategic necessity but also by values rooted in history and culture. This cultural foundation allows India to engage with multiple powers without being overshadowed or dictated to. When critics like Navarro reduce such a nuanced and sophisticated strategy to a war, they not only insult India, but also reveal a lack of understanding of how modern diplomacy works. India's independent diplomacy is not about hostility, but about balance, resilience, and foresight. It is about ensuring that India remains a decisive global actor rather than a passive follower. By maintaining independence, India secures its sovereignty, protects its economy, and ensures it can navigate the turbulent waters of global politics without being swept away by the currents of great power rivalry. In the end, India's independent diplomacy is one of its greatest strengths. It allows the country to engage flexibly with different partners to protect its national interests and to command respect on the global stage. Far from being a liability or a provocation, it is a model of how a nation can survive and thrive in an era of shifting alliances and unpredictable crises. Those who mischaracterize it reveal more about their own narrow worldviews than about India's policies. For India, independence in diplomacy is not just a choice, it is an identity. The call for higher standards in leadership has never been more urgent than it is today. In a world where words spoken by leaders can ripple across continents in seconds and decisions made in closed rooms can affect millions of lives, Jeffrey Sachs' criticism of Peter Navarro, labeling him the worst student from Harvard, is not just a personal attack but a larger commentary on the type of people who rise to positions of influence in modern politics. It highlights the fact that those entrusted with leadership, whether in government, economics, or international relations, must embody wisdom, responsibility, and respect for truth, rather than reckless ambition and shallow rhetoric. When standards in leadership are lowered, the consequences are global, and they often harm the very people these leaders are supposed to serve. High standards in leadership begin with intellectual honesty. Leaders and their advisors must be willing to confront reality as it is, not as they wish it to be. They must base their arguments and policies on facts, evidence, and sound reasoning. Navarro's aggressive rhetoric and oversimplification of India's stance into a so-called war is an example of what happens when intellectual standards are abandoned. Instead of engaging with the complexity of India's independent diplomacy, he chose to reduce it to a headline-grabbing phrase. This kind of leadership is not about solving problems, it is about amplifying them. Sachs' critique, therefore, is a reminder that leadership should demand intellectual rigor and an understanding of nuance, not slogans and exaggerations. Another essential standard for leadership is humility. True leaders recognize that they do not know everything and that listening, learning, and adapting are critical to effective governance. Too often, however, individuals in power succumb to arrogance, mistaking their position for proof of infallibility. When advisors like Navarro project simplistic narratives onto complex international relations, they reveal a lack of humility and a failure to appreciate the perspectives of other nations. For a leader or advisor of a global power like the United States, such shortcomings are especially damaging. Humility allows leaders to engage in dialogue rather than confrontation, to build alliances rather than sow divisions. Without it, leadership becomes authoritarian and brittle. Ethical responsibility is another cornerstone of high-standard leadership. Leaders are entrusted with power not for personal glory or partisan victories, but for the well-being of people, both within their nation and beyond. Every statement, every policy, and every decision must be weighed against its impact on human lives. When reckless rhetoric is used to describe India's foreign policy, it does not merely insult another government, it shapes public opinion, influences markets, and alters diplomatic relationships. Leaders who fail to recognize this responsibility abdicate their duty. High standards in leadership demand a commitment to ethics, to ensuring that power is exercised with fairness, justice, and respect for human dignity. Vision is equally important. Leadership is not just about managing crises, it is about imagining and working toward a better future. Great leaders inspire confidence because they offer a clear and constructive vision of where they want their country and the world to go. They focus on building cooperation, prosperity, and peace. By contrast, leaders who dwell on conflict and frame international relationships in terms of wars reveal a poverty of vision. They rely on fear and antagonism to maintain relevance rather than on hope and progress. Sachs' call for higher standards implicitly points to the need for for leaders with vision, leaders who can see beyond immediate political gain and work toward long-term stability and cooperation. Accountability must be central to leadership. When leaders or advisors make mistakes, they must be willing to admit them and learn from them. Too often, reckless words or poor policies are defended stubbornly, even when they are shown to be harmful. This unwillingness to take responsibility erodes trust and credibility. High standards in leadership require transparency, accountability, and the courage to correct course when necessary. Without these qualities, leaders become disconnected from reality and unfit to guide their nations. The world today is interconnected in ways never before seen. The challenges of climate change, economic inequality, pandemics, and global security cannot be solved by reckless rhetoric or weak leadership. They demand high standards, leaders who are wise, humble, ethical, visionary, and accountable. Sachs' criticism of Navarro is more than an academic quarrel. It is a warning about what happens when low standards are allowed to dominate politics. It reminds us all that the quality of leadership matters because the fate of nations and the well-being of billions depend on it. The power of words and narratives in shaping public perception, international relations, and policy decisions cannot be overstated. Words are far more than simple means of communication. They are instruments that can inspire, mislead, unite, or divide. In the context of global politics, the narratives constructed by leaders, advisors, and influential figures carry immense weight. Peter Navarro's labeling of India's actions as Modi's war exemplifies how a single phrase, carelessly spoken, can distort reality, influence public opinion, and even affect the strategic calculations of nations. The significance of language in governance is profound. Words do not exist in isolation. They create frameworks through which people interpret events, assign blame or praise, and make decisions. Words have the capacity to simplify complex realities, which can be both a strength and a danger. Effective communication requires clarity, but when leaders reduce nuanced diplomatic or economic policies to a slogan or inflammatory phrase, they risk creating misconceptions. Navarro's rhetoric transformed India's independent diplomatic strategy, which is based on balance and sovereignty, into a confrontational narrative of aggression. This oversimplification misrepresents India's intentions and feeds into a larger story of conflict that may not exist. Once such a narrative takes root, it is difficult to reverse. People, whether citizens, media, or policymakers, begin to interpret every action through the lens of that narrative, which can escalate misunderstandings and hinder productive engagement. Narratives also shape public perception domestically and internationally. For example, when Navarro's comment was reported in U.S. and Indian media, it was not just a casual remark. It became a lens through which millions interpreted U.S.-India relations. In India, citizens may perceive the statement as disrespectful or hostile, potentially hardening attitudes toward the United States. In the U.S., it may reinforce a view of India as an adversary rather than a strategic partner. This demonstrates how powerful narratives can be in influencing opinions, shaping policy debates, and ultimately affecting the diplomatic environment. In a world where media coverage is instantaneous and global, the consequences of careless words are amplified. Furthermore, narratives influence policy decisions. Policymakers rely on information, analyses, and public discourse to make informed choices. If the narrative circulating in the public domain is misleading or framed to provoke conflict, it can pressure decision makers to adopt positions based on perception rather than reality. Navarro's rhetoric risks encouraging a confrontational approach in Washington that may not be warranted by the facts on the ground. Narratives have the ability to dictate agendas, justify actions, and even constrain the room for negotiation. A mischaracterized story can set the stage for unnecessary escalation rather than cooperation and diplomacy. The power of words extends beyond immediate politics. It shapes history. How events are remembered, studied, and interpreted depends heavily on the narratives constructed at the time. A careless or biased statement can enter textbooks, news archives, and public memory, influencing future generations' understanding of international relations. Navarro's remark, if left unchecked or uncontextualized, risks becoming a reference point for an exaggerated narrative about India's foreign policy, undermining the country's global image. Leaders and advisors must therefore recognize that their words have enduring consequences that reach far beyond the moment they are spoken. The strategic use of narratives can build or destroy trust. Words framed responsibly can foster cooperation, mutual understanding, and problem solving. Conversely, reckless narratives can erode trust, create suspicion, and make collaboration difficult. Trust is the foundation of international relations. Once it is damaged by false or inflammatory narratives, rebuilding it can take decades. In a world of global interdependence where economies, security, and environmental concerns are intertwined, maintaining trust through careful communication is essential. Words carry moral and ethical weight. Leaders and advisors are not simply commentators. They are actors whose language can affect lives, economies, and national security. The narratives they construct influence behavior, perceptions, and policies across nations. Careless words like Modi's war illustrate the dangers of neglecting this responsibility. They serve as a reminder that language is not neutral. It is a tool that can either constructively guide the world toward cooperation or recklessly push it toward misunderstanding and conflict. The power of words and narratives is immense, shaping how nations interact, how citizens perceive each other, and how leaders make decisions. Navarro's statement demonstrates the risks when words are used irresponsibly, emphasizing the urgent need for thoughtful, precise, and ethical communication in global affairs. In diplomacy and leadership, words are not just tools, they are instruments of influence, responsibility, and ultimately power.